In part one of our video series, we began telling the Bible story using a timeline. We showed how the story begins with God's creation of the heavens and the earth and comes all the way down to our time. We showed that there are two main events on this timeline: God speaking to Moses and Israel at Mount Sinai, and Jesus' death on the cross, and how those two events separate Bible time into three periods. Those periods are the patriarchal period, when God spoke to the fathers of families, the Mosaic period, when God spoke to Israel through Moses, and the Christian period, where God speaks to all people through his Son Jesus Christ. We also looked closely at the events of the patriarchal period in our first video. Follow the link on the screen to view part one if you have not already done so. In the patriarchal period, God tells us how sin entered the world. Satan, in the form of a serpent, deceives Eve, and she ate of the tree that God had said not to eat. Adam participated in that sin. God intervenes, and while speaking to the serpent, he makes a promise to deal with Satan. God said in Genesis 3, verse 15, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." There will be enmity or conflict between the seed of the woman and Satan. That conflict will result in Satan's head being bruised or crushed, while Satan will merely bruise the heel of the woman's seed. Further down the timeline in the patriarchal period, we read of God making another seed promise. This was one of three promises to Abraham. God told Abraham that he would give him a land, make him a great nation, and the third promise was stated this way in Genesis 22:18. "In your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." The patriarchal period reveals how sin entered the world and gives us some information about how God is going to deal with sin. The seed of woman will crush Satan, and the seed of Abraham will be a blessing to all nations. The patriarchal period closes with the descendants of Abraham moving to Egypt to survive a very hard famine that had come upon the entire region. That ends the book of Genesis. As the next book opens, nearly 400 years have passed. The children of Israel, Abraham's descendants, are still in Egypt, but their situation has changed. They are now slaves of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. We are approaching the next period in the Bible story, the Mosaic period. Exodus begins by introducing our next significant character on the timeline, Moses. You will remember that at God's direction, Moses goes to Pharaoh and demands Pharaoh to let God's people go free. Pharaoh refuses, and God, through Moses, brings a series of 10 plagues on Egypt. The last plague, the death of all the firstborn in Egypt, is the final straw, and Pharaoh tells Moses to take the children of Israel and leave the country. The people leave in what is called the Exodus, and by a miracle of God, they cross through the Red Sea on dry ground and enter the Sinai Peninsula. There they come to Mount Sinai and meet with God. God gives them laws, including the 10 Commandments, and establishes them as his nation. Listen to what God says to them in Exodus 19, verses 4 through 6. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God makes them a special treasure and a holy nation. That is a very important statement because God has now fulfilled the second of the 3 promises he made to Abraham, the promise to make him a great nation. Also notice the condition God places on the fulfillment of this promise. "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people." Their being a special treasure to God required the people to obey and keep his covenant. We'll notice more about that later on in their history. Moses and the nation of Israel remain at Mount Sinai for 2 years. During that time, God gives them his laws. He tells them how to set up their worship, which involved building the tabernacle, a portable worship structure, and how to offer animal sacrifices. What was the purpose of the animal sacrifices? In Leviticus 17, verse 11, God says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul." By offering these animals, God gave the people a method to deal with their sins and be able to obtain forgiveness. There were many different sacrifices for different kinds of sin, but in each case, an animal had to die and its blood had to be shed in order for the sin to be atoned or forgiven. After their time at Sinai, Moses dies. The books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy detail this period. Upon Moses' death, Joshua takes over as the leader of Israel. It is now time for Israel to receive another of the promises God made to Abraham. Joshua leads them into the promised land, and under his leadership, Israel obtains the land God promised to Abraham. Listen to what Joshua says to the nation at the end of his life. In Joshua 23, verse 14, talking about their conquest of the land, Joshua says, "Behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and in your souls that not one thing has failed of the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one word of them has failed." The first promise God made to Abraham is now fulfilled, the land promise. After Joshua dies, the nation begins to stray from their service to the true God, and they start worshiping idols. Because of their unfaithfulness, God allowed surrounding nations to attack Israel and punish them. When the people became distressed, God would send them a leader and defeat their enemies. Israel would be faithful for a time, but then revert to their sinful ways. There were several of these leaders, and they were called judges. The period of the judges lasted about 450 years. The period of the judges ends with the people demanding to have a king like the nations around them. God selects Saul to be their king. Saul was rebellious toward God, so God removed Saul and appointed David to reign in his place. David was very faithful to the Lord, and even when he sinned, he always returned to the Lord and served him. God made a promise to David that will sound very familiar. In 1 Chronicles 17, verses 11 through 14, we read, "And it shall be, when your days are fulfilled, when you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up your seed after you, who will be one of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. I will not take my mercy away from him as I took it from him who was before you. And I will establish him in my house and in my kingdom forever. His throne shall be established forever." There's our word seed again. God says, "I will set up your seed after you." Here is yet another seed promise that God makes. After David died, his son Solomon takes the throne. He built a temple for God, but Solomon is not the primary person under consideration here. The seed who will take David's throne is one who will rule on David's throne forever. Solomon died. There is a future seed to come who will be the ruler on David's throne. Let's continue the timeline. David's son Solomon takes over after David's death, and he eventually fails to follow God faithfully. Because of this, God tells Solomon that the kingdom will divide after he dies. The kingdom does indeed divide, and two nations are formed. The northern portion of the nation becomes known as Israel, and the southern portion is called Judah. The kings of Israel are never faithful to God and suffer many dynasty changes. Even after warnings by multiple prophets sent by God, the kings never follow God. The prophets predict Israel's destruction, and in 722 BC, Israel is defeated by the Assyrians. All of its citizens are removed from the land, and the nation ceases to exist. There is no return. The nation of Judah remains, and David's descendants continue to reign as its kings. Some are faithful to God, but most are not, and the nation becomes more and more wicked. Several of the prophets begin to predict Judah's fall unless they repent, but they don't, and beginning in 606 BC, the Babylonians conquer Israel after 3 waves of attacks, and the people are taken captive into Babylon. God, through Jeremiah the prophet, tells the people that they will be in captivity for 70 years, and once the 70 years are completed, they will return to the land to rebuild the temple, the city of Jerusalem, and the walls. All of that happens just as God said. Even after all that, Judah does not properly honor God, and Jeremiah and several of the prophets tell of a coming change when a Messiah will appear, preceded by a messenger. The Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi. Only one page separates the books of Malachi and Matthew in our Bibles. Yet from the last page of Malachi to the first page of Matthew, 400 years will again pass. Let's review what we've learned from the Mosaic period. During this time, God fulfills 2 of the 3 promises to Abraham. The nation promise, when God brings Israel out of Egypt and makes them his nation, and the land promise, when, under the leadership of Joshua, the nation takes the promised land. Only the seed promise remains to be fulfilled. Through this Old Testament history, God is building a character witness for himself to teach us that he keeps the promises he makes and he can be trusted. He also teaches us that in order to deal with sin, blood must be shed. During the Mosaic period, God set up the sacrificial system that provided opportunity for sins to be forgiven by the blood of animals. However, this solution for sin was not fully sufficient. The New Testament book of Hebrews tells us about the problem in Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4. For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. For then would they not have ceased to have been offered? For the worshippers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Notice the problems cited here. Animal sacrifices cannot make the one offering the sacrifice perfect. Why? Because in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. Why is that? Because the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. Animal blood is not sufficient to completely remove sin. Someone might ask, why did God call Moses, give him those laws, set up animal sacrifices, and have the people go through all of that if it didn't accomplish anything? Well, it did accomplish something, but what it accomplished was not complete or perfect. That is the very question asked and answered in Galatians 3, verse 19. What purpose, then, did the law serve? It was added because of transgressions till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. It seems that God set up this system to force the faithful followers to ask this question: what can I do to get rid of my sins? They keep coming back and are never really gone. The answer to that question is, we cannot do anything to remove our sins. Then what is the answer? The answer is in those seed promises. The promise to Eve that her seed would come and bruise or crush the head of Satan. The promise to Abraham that in his seed all nations of the earth will be blessed. The promise to David that through his seed one would come who will rule on David's throne forever. Well, that leads us to the final period of time, the Christian period. In our next video, we will pull all of this together and witness the amazing wisdom of God. Be sure to like this video. It helps me get this message out to many others, and it costs you nothing but a mouse click to do it. To view the next video, click on the link on the screen. Please ask any questions or make any comments in the comment section below. Thank you so much for listening.